Well, Saturday Night Live apparently getting under President Trump's skin this weekend. President Trump tweeted, "How do the networks get away with these total Republican hit jobs without retribution? Very unfair and should be looked into. This is the real collusion." That tweet came after this sketch.
So I'm going to sign these papers for emergency, and then I'll immediately be sued, and the ruling will not go in my favor, and then I'll end up in the Supreme Court, and then I'll call my buddy Kavanaugh, and I'll say it's time to repay the Donnie, and he'll say, "New phone, who dis?" But then the Mueller report will be released, crumbling my house of cards, and I can just plead insanity and do a few months in the puzzle factory. And my personal hell of playing president will finally be over.
Joining us now is Brian Stelter, CNN chief media correspondent and anchor of Reliable Sources. The president really wants to retaliate against a comedy show. He wants somebody to look into what SNL is doing. Who? The comedy police?
Yeah, laugh so you don't cry. Seriously, look, he should not be talking about retribution. It's unpresidential. And yet, we've seen this story for the last 2 years. He'll make a ridiculous threat that's completely inappropriate, but then he doesn't do anything about it, and everybody forgets about it, and everybody moves on. I mean, he's threatened NBC's licenses in the past and then not done anything about it. But I do think he's giving Alec Baldwin exactly what Alec Baldwin wants. I could actually argue that Baldwin's sketch and his impersonations getting a little boring, getting a little tired, getting a little predictable. But then President Trump comes along and gives it new life and gives it new energy. And I think in a way, Trump keeps Baldwin going playing Trump. You know what I mean? They're locked in this twisted relationship.
This dysfunctional relationship. Well, I actually, when Baldwin at the end, when he says, "My personal hell of playing the president will be over," seemed to work both ways on that one.
I think he's,
But in all seriousness, when the president tweets that there should be retribution, someone should look into this. Obviously, the reason nothing happens is that there is no comedy police, and we do have a First Amendment.
Yet.
But what is he trying to communicate? I mean, what does he think is out there that can be done to address his grievances?
Right, it's us versus them. And I think maybe, the only thing that does exist in this case is the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, which does grant licenses to NBC's local television stations pretty much every time. They just get renewed automatically every 8 years. So conceivably, any president could try to meddle in that. Nixon tried to do that 4 decades ago. That's really the only option he has other than tweeting and angrily tweeting. Baldwin shot back last night and said, "Is this a threat?
Yes.
I'm one of the enemies of the people now. Does this constitute a threat to my family's safety?" So now they're going back and forth. Again, part of that twisted relationship. But the reality is there is nothing the president can do. And there's Baldwin's tweet saying, what about
I'll read
this?
it. Yeah, he says, "I wonder if a sitting president exhorting his followers that my role in a TV comedy qualifies me as an enemy of the people constitutes a threat to my safety and that of my family." It doesn't sound like he's laughing. I mean, I hear you that it helps Alec Baldwin's brand, I guess, or the act. But to be on the receiving end of the president saying nasty things, it's not always great. Not always a great feeling.
It is
as you know,
deeply uncomfortable for people, whether you're a celebrity like Alec Baldwin or not. We come back and forth often with President Trump about whether there's these authoritarian impulses to try to control the media versus a kind of insecurity or even an incompetence. He's just venting. He's just complaining. Nobody takes it seriously. And that's the strange place we're in now, 2 years into the presidency, right? That he says these things that are outrageous and inappropriate, and yet we shrug it off because he never does anything about it. That's not a healthy place to be for a country.
Well, and that's a sign of normalization. And given that it's President's Day, you've got to search long and hard for anything resembling a precedent for this. I mean, maybe Richard Nixon venting a spleen against the Smothers Brothers and allegedly getting the show canceled back in the day through some of his allies. But it's ironic, when he talks about these actions against media companies in one country in the world where that certainly does happen, and it's the one he's giving a speech about later today, Venezuela. So it does strike, I think, the surreality of the fact that we've almost come to shrug these things off. The President of the United States going after a satirical show, going after an actor.
I like what Chuck Schumer said in response to SNL, because Schumer and Pelosi were parodied on Saturday night as well. And Schumer offered an alternative way to respond. Here he is saying, he enjoyed the spoof. He actually linked to it. He liked it so much he linked to it. But he said, actually, I don't use a smartphone. I use a flip phone. That's kind of what we're used to from politicians. That's how politicians in the past have usually reacted to SNL.
Well, yes, but the problem is, and this is one of the very unique things about President Trump, he's humorless. He is humor impaired. This is not an original thought today. He has never been captured laughing on any camera of any kind. He has never made a joke, at least not a funny one. He doesn't He's humor impaired. And so, I mean, name a time.
Humor impaired.
He's massively humor impaired. So he doesn't, I don't know if he can't think like Chuck Schumer is to go back with a quip and say something funny and self-deprecating.
I see what you're saying.
Impossible.
I see.
Well, and actually, the few times I have seen him make a scripted self-deprecating joke, it's been very effective. Self-deprecating humor is very effective for politicians.
Definitely.
But because he's sort of humor deficient, certainly that's not happening off the cuff.
You would think he would want to go on SNL. Be in on the joke, be part of the joke. After all, he did do that before becoming president. But maybe something changed along the way. And I think the one that's benefiting here is Alec Baldwin. He's the one that's benefiting because his impersonation gets new life whenever the president complains about it.
Or maybe increased awareness of the First Amendment.
That too, that's a good thing.
As President Trump declared a national emergency over fortifying U.S. borders, a critical relationship with our allies overseas may be deteriorating. The Munich Security Conference report concluded that, quote, U.S. efforts would be far more credible if President Trump and his administration did not display an irritating enthusiasm for strongmen across the globe. And, quote, the disdain for the international institutions and agreements has repeatedly pitted the U.S. against its major allies in recent years. So, this growing rift between the U.S. and allies on display several times during the conference as Vice President Mike Pence was standing up there, of course, representing the Trump administration. And I want to play this clip and pay special attention to the notable silence when Pence drops the president's name.
And I especially want to invite all of you to thank Senator Lindsey Graham for leading this delegation. And to them and to all of you, I bring greetings from a great champion of freedom and of strong national defense who has worked with these members of Congress to strengthen America's military might and to strengthen the leadership of the free world. I bring greetings from the 45th President of the United States of America, President Donald Trump.
Little awkward. CNN analyst David Sanger is with us. He's a national security correspondent for the New York Times. And my goodness, that moment, and I know you also wrote about the moment in Warsaw prior to Munich. How would you characterize this? Is this just like a total reshuffling of the world order playing out right before our eyes?
It sure felt like that. I was in Munich during that speech, and the silence was just deafening. All the more remarkable, Brooke, because there were more than 50 members of Congress who went over to the Munich Security Conference, roughly evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. And we didn't even hear the clapping from the Republicans, which was sort of the shock from this. And I think he was a bit shocked. It was the second sort of embarrassing moment for Vice President Pence. He had been in Warsaw 2 days before for that a conference about Iran that gathered all the Arab leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, the Europeans. And in the middle of his speech to this assembled group, he managed somehow or another to slip in a paragraph attacking the British, French, and Germans for not renouncing the Iran nuclear deal, which they've been trying to save, and turned the entire headlines of this from everybody gathering against Iran to the vice president attacks his oldest allies.
So you point out what happened there in Warsaw. We pointed out the moment in Munich. There was another moment where you were there where Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, called out the Trump administration on several occasions. And so I'll play this clip and we'll watch for the reaction from Ivanka Trump, who was in the room.
Apparently, the American Secretary of Trade says German cars are a threat to America's national security. We're proud of our automotive industry, and I think we can be. We're proud of our cars. They are built in the United States of America. South Carolina is one of the largest. It's actually the largest BMW plant, not in Bavaria. South Carolina is supplying China. So when these cars, that because they're built in South Carolina, are not becoming less threatening, rather than the ones that are built in Bavaria, are supposed to be a threat to the national security of America, it's a bit of a shock to us.
So she's calling out the Trump administration. what is the danger? I mean, you even going back to the shade that the vice president, tried throwing on several of our good European friends. What is, like, long game this for me? What is the danger with all of this?
Sure. So, Brooke, first of all, this was Chancellor Merkel sort of unleashed. She's now, it's pretty clear that she's going to be out of office in 2 years, at which point she will have served 15 or 16 years in office. I have never seen her as fiery as she was in that discussion at the Munich Security Conference.
Oh, wow.
And, she handed it right back to them on cars, which, as she said, they're making in South Carolina. And she was immediately followed by Pence. So what's the big difference here? So I've been going to this for a few years, more years than I'd like to admit, Brooke. And I would say 2 years ago, the view was, well, President Trump has come in, but it won't be as bad as it sounded on the campaign. Last year, H.R. McMaster was there in his last days, and General Mattis, or Defense Secretary Mattis, in his last days as Defense Secretary, and they sort of let out a fairly normal, we want to build up with the allies, we want to work with the allies set of speeches that led people to say, well, don't worry, the adults in the room will take care of this. This year, they basically said, we're finished with this. We're just going to wait out the next 2 years. But there was no effort to try to sort of make amends with the Trump administration.
But as someone who has seen the arc of through the years and covering this, how worrisome, how dangerous is the direction in which we're all going?
It's dangerous because we've forgotten who our closest allies coming out of World War II were. And it was notable that Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, ended up holding that Iran conference in Warsaw, a new member of NATO, an increasingly authoritarian democracy, if that doesn't sound too jarring, and one that is not invested in the Iran deal. He could not have held that conference in London, in Paris, or in Berlin. And that really begins to tell you that you're seeing a sharp split. Now, the question is, could things go back to normal, 4 years from now, 2 years from now, 6 years from now, whatever,
Yeah.
Maybe. But my sense of this is things never quite go back to where they were.
Sure. As we sit and marinate on that, I want to just ask you briefly about Asia, because just as the president is planning, his second summit with Kim Jong-un, a close friend of the president's, Chris Ruddy, just made news. I visited the president over the weekend at Mar-a-Lago. He just said this.
I'm hearing from sources around the White House there's just general disappointment of the president with Director Coates. There's a feeling that maybe there needs to be a change of leadership in that position coming up.
So did you talk to him about it? Do you think he'll dismiss Director Coates?
Well, I don't know what his plan is. He doesn't tell me who he's going to dismiss or not. I have talked to various people, not him, that are very close in the White House with the security positions the president is taking.
So the president's director of national intelligence, DNI, Dan Coats, was at the worldwide threats hearing, and he concluded that North Korea was unlikely to give up its nuclear arsenal. And just a little bit of context, David, we remember during that interview some months ago at the Aspen Security Conference, and it was Dan Coats up on stage, and that was when he found out Putin was getting an invite to the White House, and we heard from Trump on Coates' reaction there, but what do you make of this potential change in leadership, and what happens with regard to North Korea if DNI Coates goes?
Well, at the worldwide threat hearing, there was no effort to try to sugarcoat their conclusions. You mentioned the one on North Korea. Director Coates also said that he believed that Iran had been complying with the nuclear accord before and after the president withdrew from it. And he also said that he believed that ISIS still had about 12 battalions after the president, of course, had said they'd been completely defeated, and that was the reason that we could leave Syria. So those are the three touchstone issues. But Director Coates has been a very quiet, sort of stabilizing force, but I think he's been unwilling to politicize the intelligence. He is not giving the president necessarily what the president wants to hear. Not the first director to have run up against a president. That's happened in past administrations as well. But in this case, we've been hearing this sort of drumbeat for a while. Director Coates has outlasted almost everybody except Mike Pompeo, right? So if he goes, Mr. Pompeo is going to be the only original member of the national security team. And I suspect he probably is about ready to go.
How about that? David Sanger, thank you for all of this, and of course for your depth of expertise over your years of covering all these conferences. Good to see you. We'll see you back up here in New York. Thank you very much.
New York City is going to be built every month for the next 40 years. What does that mean? Is that good or bad?
Well, I use that as an opportunity to explain that when people think of climate change, they think mostly about electricity, and that's only a quarter of the emissions come from coal, natural gas plants that are generating your electricity. When we make materials like steel and cement, those two alone are about 1/8 of the emissions. And so the fact that we're going to build these cities, that the world is urbanizing, means that unless you have a totally zero-emission way of making steel and cement, then you haven't come near to solving the overall climate problem. And so moving away, the term clean energy has handicapped the field because that makes people think, oh, maybe it's just electricity and passenger cars, and they don't see agriculture, industry, buses, trains as part of the problem.
One crucial part is agriculture, and one thing you said you were particularly surprised by was how great a problem bovine flatulence is. Do you want to explain what that is and why it's a problem?
Yeah, so the animals that can eat grass have very unusual stomachs that have these bacteria that are methanogenic in there. And so they leak natural gas, both out the front and the back. And so people have said, well, let's change the hay or throw some things in there. And nobody knows how to get rid of
No one knows how to get cows to stop farting.
Exactly, or burping. And so there is artificial meat, but that's at a very early stage. But that's another big source of greenhouse gas emissions. So, I'm just trying to make sure that the people who acknowledge the problem, which I think is fantastic, that they understand the breadth of innovation required before you can get anywhere near to what we have to do, which is zero. If it was a 50% reduction, then you could ignore, okay, leave the cows alone. But because we're trying to avoid the temperature continuing to go up, you do need to go to zero. Otherwise, you're continuing to have temperature increase.
You threw a party in Beijing, a toilet fair. Why are you obsessed with toilets?
Well, I guess I'm obsessed. The challenge is that with the world urbanizing in these developing countries, the biggest cities in the world will be places like Lagos, 20, 30 million people. And the way we think of sanitation in the rich world is we build sewer systems, we put a lot of clean water in, and we build a processing plant. That is so expensive that these developing country cities won't have it. And so whenever you tour a slum, you might smell or see that human waste is not being removed and processed. And so the new idea is that the toilet itself would essentially burn up the human waste, turn it into ash, and get rid of both the smell and the disease-causing nature of human waste. And that's the challenge we put to engineers 7 years ago. And in Beijing, we showed how far we've come. So we have toilets that do this magic thing. They are 10 times more expensive than they'll need to be, but we're encouraged. We'll get those out, sell them to places like tourist areas, and use that volume, hopefully over the next 5 years, to get this $500 self-contained toilet.
So when you look at the problem of climate change, and as you said, to get to zero emissions involves revolutions in, dozens and dozens of crucial parts of the world. You've got, the problem of toilets. You've got massive urbanization. You've got the reality of Africa with all these young men. Doesn't it get you down? Doesn't it make you think these problems are insurmountable? They're so large.
No, absolutely not. I mean, you have to remember the base case. We were all subsistence farmers, and on average, people lived to about age 30. And then as energy came along, industrial revolution, and the digital revolution, and the understanding of biology, life has improved dramatically. And so childhood death went from about 10% before our foundation got going. Now, with our partners, we have it down to 5% globally. Children die before the age of 5.
And it used to be 10%, it's now 5%. So you've cut it in half.
Exactly. So that's 6 million children a year who survive that were not surviving as recently as 1990. So, I see incredible progress. Yes, you can worry about nuclear war, pandemics, the AI takeover, polarization. There's many things that we as humans should be worried about and think about, okay, how do we minimize that risk or adapt to that problem, including climate change. And, I've probably put more investments in to these various innovations, including better seeds to help with the adaptation piece, because we will have warming. Even if things go perfectly, there's a lot more warming coming between now and the end of the century in the perfect case. It's a world of immense progress. You'd rather be born today, if you're a woman, a gay person, a person who gets a disease, you'd rather be born today than 20 years ago. And, I feel very strongly you'd rather be born 20 years from now than today.